Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a topic that oh, feels like it should be common sense, right? But maybe it's not quite that simple. This is a fascinating one brought to us by you, our listener.
It really is. And you tied the idea of common sense straight to that classic quote. You know what happens when you assume? You make an ass out of you and me.
Exactly.
That quote, it just immediately flags the central tension we're exploring today, doesn't it?
Right. This idea that common sense should be this universal, obvious thing everyone gets.
Huh?
But the quote throws a wrench in that, warns about, projecting your reality onto others.
Mm-hmm.
What if that very assumption that everyone sees it the way you do, what if that's where all the trouble starts?
Precisely. And we've got a great stack of sources here looking at common sense and assumptions from, well, all sorts of angles. Communication, sociology, psychology.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is to really dig into this material. We're going to try and pull out the key insights on what common sense actually is, according to these sources, where its dangers truly lie, and maybe most importantly, how we can navigate all of it for, clearer, better communication.
Let's start with the sources do.
Yeah.
Just trying to define common sense. Traditionally, how do these sources describe it? What is it supposed to be?
Well, they generally point to it as, like, sound practical judgment. It's the kind of knowledge you pick up just from everyday experience, right? Not necessarily formal training or, book learning.
It's just knowing stuff because you've been around.
Yeah, exactly.
And right there, the sources immediately jump on the challenge. That definition assumes we all share the same everyday experience.
Which, obviously we don't. Your, say, 30 years of navigating the world are going to be wildly different from someone else's 10 years or someone else's 70, or someone who grew up in a completely different country or a different socioeconomic situation.
Exactly. The sources really underscore that common sense is heavily filtered. It's cultural, it changes over time, it depends on the situation. What seems completely obvious, like total common sense to you, can be utterly foreign or even, well, foolish to someone else because their filters, their experiences are just different.
So that assume quote isn't just some funny saying, it's actually a pretty serious warning. It's basically telling you, hey, be really careful when you're talking to someone and you think, well, that's just obvious.
Right.
Because your definition of obvious is totally shaped by your unique background, your life.
It's that first step into the minefield, isn't it? Assuming your internal map is the territory everyone else is walking around in. And the sources, they layer in a really critical point here. This isn't just about individual ignorance or, not knowing something.
Okay.
They touch on what's sometimes called the myth of the neutral observer.
Oh, okay. Tell me about that. Sounds interesting.
It's this idea that common sense feels objective. It feels like a universal truth we can all just tap into. But the sources argue it's actually deeply situated knowledge. It's filtered.
Situated how? Like by
Culture, experience, language, class, background, all that. But also things like maybe past difficult experiences or even how your brain is wired differently.
Oh, like trauma or neurotype could affect your common sense.
Precisely. What seems like just obvious practical judgment to one person might be completely different or even inaccessible to someone else because of those unique filters. It's sort of an illusion of shared context. Often it's just the average of where experiences happen to overlap. And sometimes those overlaps are surprisingly thin,
Wow. Okay, that reframes it entirely. It's not truth. It's more like similarity or shared experience.
Yeah.
Okay, let's make this more concrete. The sources give some great examples of classic common sense items.
Right.
But then they add this crucial layer, the risk level involved if that assumption, that common sense isn't actually shared between people.
Yeah, this scale is really helpful. It helps us gauge the potential fallout when our common sense baseline doesn't match someone else's. Should we run through a few?
Definitely. Let's start with the big one. Look both ways before crossing the street. Seems pretty basic.
Presented as a fundamental safety norm, right. If someone doesn't operate with this assumption, the risk is clearly high. We're talking severe physical harm, potentially death. It's basic physics and survival instinct kicking in there.
Makes sense. That's a rule derived from a pretty universal reality. Getting hit by a car hurts badly. Okay, how about something more social? Like don't interrupt people when they're talking.
Okay, so that's etiquette, right? A social norm. The risk level, if someone doesn't share that assumption, the sources tend to put it at moderate.
Moderate. Why?
Well, you might miss important information, which causes miscommunication, Or maybe more commonly, you're perceived as disrespectful, which can damage rapport, create friction.
Yeah, definitely causes friction. Okay, different context. Don't lie to your boss.
Workplace norm. Risk here. The sources say, oh, moderate to oh, high. It could be moderate if it's a small fib that maybe results in a warning, but it could easily be high risk if the lie leads to serious disciplinary action or even getting fired. Depends heavily on the lie in the workplace, obviously.
Right, the consequences aren't just social awkwardness. They can seriously impact your livelihood there. Stakes go way up.
Absolutely.
How about something domestic like don't microwave metal?
Ah, practical household safety.
Yeah.
Based on knowing how microwaves actually work. Again, that's a high risk. You could start a fire, damage property. You learn this usually through an explicit warning or, well, hopefully not experience.
Yeah, let's hope it's the warning. Okay, shifting gears to social rituals, bring a gift to a housewarming party.
Okay, this one's more social or cultural etiquette. The risk level here is usually O to O moderate. It's low if the host genuinely doesn't care or notice, but it could creep into moderate if, in that specific social circle or cultural context, not bringing a gift is seen as a significant snub, causing real awkwardness or offense.
Right, depends on the expectations.
Yeah.
And similar one with cultural nuances. Don't ask strangers about their salary.
Yeah, the sources mention this as predominantly a Western social boundary. Risk, probably all low. Mostly, it's just seen as rude or inappropriate. The usual consequences may be an awkward silence or someone politely or not so politely changing the subject. It's unlikely to cause major damage, though norms do vary.
Okay, speaking of cultural variation, this next one is a fantastic example of common sense not being common at all. Make eye contact when you're talking to someone.
Oh, absolutely. The sources flag this as having a slight low to haste, moderate risk, and being highly culturally variable.
How so?
Well, in some cultures, avoiding eye contact is actually a sign of respect, especially towards elders or people in authority. But in others, like many Western contexts, direct eye contact is expected. It signals attentiveness, honesty.
So assuming your norm is the universal one is a major communication trap there.
Huge trap. You could easily cause offense or be misunderstood, whichever side of that cultural divide you're on, just by doing what feels normal or common sense to you.
These examples really drive home how even simple, seemingly obvious things are just loaded with potential misunderstandings if our backgrounds, our filters, our experiences don't line up.
They really show that the word common in common sense is often the most fragile part of the phrase. And the sources actually introduce a framework for thinking about this potential fallout. They call it the assumption danger scale.
Okay, assumption danger scale. Tell me about the tiers.
Right. So the sources basically categorize these common sense assumptions based on how bad things get if there's a mismatch. Tier 1 is critical shared knowledge.
This is the really serious stuff, right?
Like-
Life or death.
Exactly. Safety, survival, major physical or financial consequences, definitely high risk. Like looking both ways before crossing the street or not microwaving that fork. These are norms where violating them is genuinely dangerous.
Got it. Makes sense. What's tier 2?
Tier 2 is normative social expectations. Think manners, etiquette, the kind of back and forth in conversation.
So like interrupting or the gift-giving thing.
Yeah, exactly. Or how comfortable people are with silence in a conversation. The risk here is us medium. Violating these norms usually leads to social friction, maybe being seen negatively or communication breaking down, but typically not, physical harm.
Okay, and tier 3?
Tier 3 is cultural aesthetic preferences. This is stuff like style, personal values, sense of humor, how you perceive time.
Like, is being 10 minutes late a big deal or not?
Right. Or what kind of humor is okay. How direct or indirect should communication be? The risk for mismatch here is generally us low. Getting these wrong is usually just a bit awkward, maybe mildly confusing, perhaps a minor social misstep, but not catastrophic.
Okay, so 3 tiers. And the real danger the sources pinpoint isn't just having different assumptions, it's what?
It's treating a tier 2 or tier 3 assumption as if it were tier 1. Ah, okay. Like reacting with the same level of outrage to someone having different table manners as you would to someone, I don't know, playing with matches near gasoline.
Precisely. Punishing someone socially or even professionally for not adhering to a non-universal norm, like a specific communication style or etiquette point, as if they've committed some critical safety violation. That's where the judgment becomes really harmful and, frankly, kind of absurd.
That makes so much sense. You see that all the time, don't you? Especially maybe across generations or cultures. One group elevates their specific etiquette or preference, treating it like it's a fundamental law of physics.
Yeah, that it's just common sense not to talk that way,
Yeah.
delivered with the same gravity as it's common sense not to step off a cliff. It misses the crucial difference in consequence.
This leads perfectly into a really powerful reframe the sources suggest. What if? What if common sense isn't an expectation we hold others to at all? What if it's more like a conversation starter?
Oh, I like that. How does that shift things? Well, instead of that internal judgment that, ugh, they should know better, the sources propose cultivating curiosity. Thinking something like, I wonder what experience or perspective shaped their response that way. Maybe I should ask.
So it moves you from judging someone based on your map to being genuinely curious about their map.
Exactly. It acknowledges their internal map is different without automatically slapping a wrong label on it. It opens the door.
It's about starting a dialogue, maybe, to check those potential assumptions, rather than just defaulting to the belief that your baseline is the baseline everyone else is operating from, or should be.
But, okay, this brings up a tricky point that you, our listener, highlighted. If we're constantly checking assumptions, if we don't just assume shared understanding sometimes, don't we risk over-communicating? Or worse, sounding condescending?
Ah, yes. This is the communication paradox the sources really get into. It's a tightrope walk.
Tell us.
Well, the risk of under-communicating is making assumptions, right? Which can lead to misunderstandings, mistakes, maybe even danger if it's a tier 1 issue. But the risk of over-communicating is coming across as condescending, patronizing.
Yeah, like you think they don't know anything.
Exactly. And that can seriously damage trust and rapport just as badly, maybe even worse in some social contexts.
So if I assume you do know something that actually you don't, I might skip explaining it. Then you're confused, maybe make a mistake, and maybe I seem aloof, like I just expect you to magically get it.
Right. On the flip side, if I assume you don't know something that you actually know perfectly well, maybe even better than I do, and I launch into this lengthy, unnecessary explanation of, oh, I look like I'm being condescending or showing off, and you probably feel underestimated, maybe even insulted, which is really corrosive to connection.
It's a really tricky balance. And the sources bring up mansplaining as a specific, though obviously gendered example of how this paradox can play out negatively.
Yes, they define mansplaining generally as that kind of overconfident, often unsolicited explanation, typically observed from a man to a woman. But crucially, their description emphasizes it's often when the speaker assumes superior knowledge without checking.
Right.
The recipient often already knows the information, maybe even better, and the whole explanation feels less like helpful sharing and more like a performance of authority, or like they're trying to establish dominance rather than collaborate.
So it's not just any explanation from a man to a woman. It's really about the underlying assumption of ignorance, the context, and that power dynamic involved.
Exactly. The sources are quite clear. It's often about the tone, the context, and that imbalance of perceived authority more than just the content itself. It's that feeling of being talked down to based on an unchecked assumption about your knowledge level.
Okay, so given this tightrope, how do we navigate it? How can we share knowledge or offer context or even just check for understanding respectfully without accidentally sounding condescending? The sources offer some practical strategies, right?
Yes, thankfully. Actionable ways to try and thread this needle. The first one is pretty foundational. Ask, don't assume.
Okay, so instead of just launching into an explanation, use phrases that kind of invite them into a conversation about what's known. Like, hey, are you already familiar with this? Or would it be helpful if I gave a bit of background here?
Exactly. This gives the other person agency. They can say, yeah, I'm good, or no, please do, or even just a quick reminder would be great. And then you can adjust your communication based on their response. You're essentially creating consent for sharing knowledge.
I like that, consent for sharing knowledge. Okay, strategy 2.
Use I positioning to frame what you're sharing.
How does that help?
It shifts the stance from potentially dominant, like, here's the objective truth, to something more personal and invitational. Phrases like, I came across something interesting about this that might be useful if you're curious, or in my experience, I've found that. It avoids asserting your knowledge over theirs.
Okay. Makes it less like a lecture, more like sharing a discovery. Got it. Strategy 3.
Signal respect for their existing knowledge, even if you do need to explain something.
How do you do that?
You can preface explanations with little phrases that acknowledge their intelligence, like, I'm sure you've probably thought about this already, but just in case it's helpful, or, you likely already know this, and maybe just to add. This preemptively counters the implication that you think they're starting from zero.
Oh, I really like that.
Yeah.
It cushions the explanation, shows you're not automatically talking down. Okay, strategy 4.
Mirror their depth. Pay close attention to how they are communicating about the topic.
So, like, match their energy.
Yeah, and that level of detail. If they give you a concise, high-level answer, keep your response relatively brief. If they start elaborating and going deep into the weeds, then you know it's probably okay for you to match that level.
So,
It helps you calibrate your explanation in real time.
makes sense. And strategy 5.
Be mindful of power dynamics, especially around things like gender, job titles, seniority, perceived expertise.
Right. The sources suggest pausing, maybe especially in professional or mixed gender settings, and asking yourself, is this explanation truly needed and likely welcomed right now? Or am I maybe just trying to assert dominance or perform my knowledge?
And critically, am I listening as much as I'm speaking?
Yeah.
It's about checking your own motives and the potential impact before you dive in.
These strategies really seem to reframe communication. It's less about just transferring information and more about, like, a collaborative exchange, a negotiation of shared understanding.
That's exactly it. Which brings us back beautifully to that more philosophical idea the sources touched on earlier, this notion of common sense as a negotiated space, something we kind of co-create together in each interaction.
Right, not a fixed thing you either have or you don't. It's more like trying to build something together when you might have slightly different instruction manuals based on your different experiences.
Yeah, the sources use that kind of idea. We might have different blueprints shaped by our filters, but we can still figure out how to build a bridge between us. It prompts different questions, doesn't it? Like what?
Oh, okay, what do we both seem to understand about this already? Or are there assumptions we should maybe check or clarify between us before we go further?
How can we share what we know in a way that builds connection, maybe without that feeling of hierarchy?
Exactly. It's a much more collaborative, less potentially confrontational way to approach those moments where misunderstanding might crop up. Respect isn't about perfect alignment from the get-go. It's about that willingness to calibrate and figure things out together.
But even with the best strategies, the best intentions, communication isn't always smooth, is it? You, our listener, also brought up the real-world constraints, limited time, energy, different skill levels, and just the fact that we're human. We mess up.
This is such a crucial layer the sources explore, because clear, compassionate communication takes energy, it takes capacity, and we often don't have limitless supplies of either, do we? Definitely not. The sources list some of these constraints, right? Like time, maybe. You just don't have the leisure for a long, careful clarification in that moment. Energy, if you're tired or stressed, you're probably more likely to be impatient, fall back on assumptions, make quick judgments.
Skill is another one. Not everyone has the same level of, say, emotional intelligence or the vocabulary to articulate complex ideas gently or precisely.
Right. And fear or vulnerability, sometimes worrying about saying the wrong thing, can make us less clear, more guarded. Or maybe we over-explain out of anxiety.
And then there's the inherent difficulty of interpretation versus a literal meaning. Is someone speaking literally, or are they using metaphor, sarcasm, understatement? Plus, those varying cultural and social norms. We talked about how direct should you be, how much politeness is expected. All of that massively impacts how messages get sent and received.
So all of that means, even when we're trying our best, we fumble, we trip over our words, our meaning doesn't quite land right. The sources have a term for this, the imperfect mirror.
Yeah, the idea that what we say isn't always a perfect reflection of what we actually mean or feel deep down. You might say, oh, I'm fine. But what you really mean is, actually, I don't feel safe enough or have the energy to explain what's really going on right now.
Or maybe you ask a seemingly simple question, but you're really looking for reassurance, not just information. Or, going back to condescension, maybe you explain something you think is simple because you genuinely want to be helpful, but your tone or phrasing makes it land really poorly.
And the listener, on the other end, is receiving this through their own filters, their own constraints, their own assumptions. And they might misinterpret entirely. They might take something literally when it was meant symbolically, or read negativity where none was intended.
So that gap between intended meaning and received meaning can be huge. And just leaning on common sense assumptions to bridge it can actually make it wider sometimes. Which brings us to a more humane bottom line that the sources seem to suggest.
You framed it really well in your initial prompt. We need to leave room for error.
Yeah. We just can't hold ourselves or other people to some impossible standard of perfect clarity every single time. We're all just trying, often navigating all those constraints we just mentioned.
And we shouldn't automatically mistake a clumsy sentence or a poorly phrased question or someone relying on a different common sense baseline for bad intentions or, a lack of intelligence. Giving that little bit of grace allows space for learning and connection.
Assuming process over perfection. Maybe the willingness to notice when communication goes sideways and then try to repair it is just as important, maybe even more important than avoiding the rupture in the first place.
This is what the sources touch on with something like the human imperfection principle. Perfection is predictable, almost mechanical, but humanity. That's in the stutter, the pause, the awkward rephrasing, the clarifying question that comes a bit too late.
It's in the follow-up text later saying, hey, thinking back on our chat, I worried I might have come across wrong.
Right. True connection, these sources seem to argue, isn't found in achieving flawless, frictionless expression all the time. It's often found in the repair work. It's in the shared understanding you manage to build after the fumble.
It's in choosing to stay engaged in the conversation, even when it's awkward, and trying to fix what went wrong between you.
So the goal isn't really to eliminate miscommunication entirely, which is probably impossible anyway. It's more about reframing how we approach it when it inevitably happens.
Right, so instead of that flawed assumption like, good communicators never make mistakes.
The reframe is more like, well, all communicators make mistakes, good ones notice, and they work to make it right.
Or instead of thinking, ugh, if they really cared about understanding me, they'd just explain it better.
It becomes, okay, if we both care about understanding each other, we'll keep trying, even when it's hard to get the words just right.
And maybe instead of, they should just know what I meant by now.
The reframe is, maybe they didn't catch my meaning through no fault of their own, but I can try again, maybe differently, to help them see it.
It's really about aiming for repair and grace and just persistent effort, isn't it? Not hitting some mythical standard of perfect common sense or flawless delivery every time.
Absolutely. Which layers in beautifully with some of the other sort of critiques or deeper angles on common sense the sources mention, like the cognitive load perspective.
Yeah, right. Common sense is just a mental shortcut to save energy, not necessarily arrogance.
Exactly. The sources suggest that sometimes leaning on those common sense assumptions isn't about thinking you know best. It might just be, well, brain tiredness. It can be a kind of band-aid for burnout where you rely on habit or inertia instead of doing the harder work of deep analysis or careful clarification.
That's actually a more compassionate way to look at why people make assumptions sometimes. They might just be trying to conserve mental energy.
It invites a bit more understanding, doesn't it? And then there's the distinction between emotional sense versus common sense.
Okay, what's that?
It's about the difference between what seems logically sound or conventionally practical, that's the common sense part, and what feels true or necessary on an emotional level, which is the emotional sense.
Give me an example.
Okay, so common sense might say, oh, it was just a joke, lighten up. But your emotional sense might be screaming, actually that hurt and I need to address it, even if it seems illogical to others.
Oh, okay.
Good communication, the sources suggest, finds a way to honor both. It recognizes that logical practicality and felt truth don't always align, and both are valid parts of human experience.
Makes sense. What about generational lag?
This is about how common sense often crystallizes around conditions that were true at a certain point in time, but maybe aren't anymore.
Like getting a college degree guarantees a good job. That was maybe common sense decades ago.
But much less of a sure thing now, right? Or maybe you don't talk about your problems outside the family. That might have been common sense for one generation, but it clashes with today's more open dialogue about mental health for another.
So the sources ask, is this piece of common sense still valid operating software for today's world? Or is it just an outdated tradition we haven't questioned?
Exactly. Which leads into perhaps the most significant critique the sources raise, this idea of common sense as a form of power.
Okay, this sounds important. And maybe a bit uncomfortable.
It can be. The point is, if certain dominant groups within a society or culture get to define what counts as common or sensible, then that definition can become a subtle or not so subtle weapon of conformity. It can be used to exclude, dismiss, or shame people who don't fit those norms.
Can you give me an example?
Well, think about the idea that hard work always pays off. While there's obviously value in effort, presenting that as simple common sense can function to mask systemic inequalities, right? It frames anyone's lack of success purely as an individual failing. They just didn't work hard enough, rather than acknowledging unequal starting points or structural barriers.
Or maybe historical common sense ideas about who belonged in certain jobs or social roles.
Precisely. The critical question becomes, who gets to decide what everyone knows? And often, the sources highlight it's the voices and experiences with the most social or institutional power that shape these perceived universals.
So the core criticisms are pretty sharp then.
Yeah, the sources summarize them well. Common sense, when wielded carelessly, excludes others by assuming a shared baseline that isn't there. It fuels lazy assumptions instead of real thought. It can shut down curiosity and deeper inquiry. Why asked? It's obvious. It can undermine the value of specialized expertise. You don't need an expert. It's just common sense. It changes over time, but often pretends it doesn't. It can be used to justify harmful traditions or biases. And, crucially, it can really reduce empathy because it encourages us to project our own reality onto others instead of trying to understand theirs.
Okay. So pulling all of this together, common sense and assumptions, they're tools, not inherently bad, maybe, but as the sources put it, they seem like fragile tools.
That's a great way to put it. They offer efficiency, quick pattern recognition, sometimes vital safety cues. Those are the pros. But the cons are significant, creating blind spots, fueling judgment, causing emotional harm, leading to arrogance or exclusion, stifling curiosity, masking privilege, undermining expertise, and eroding empathy.
So the key takeaway, the sources seem to reiterate, is that common sense is best understood as a starting point. It's a reflection of your group's norms, maybe?
Yeah.
It's a default mental shortcut that really needs to be checked and questioned.
Right. It's a mirror reflecting your context, your experiences. It's not some absolute truth or a reliable lens for judging everyone else. The goal isn't, and probably can't be, to eliminate assumptions entirely. That's maybe impossible. But we can try to eliminate them.
Make them visible, conscious.
Exactly. And replace that feeling of rigid certainty, this is just how it is, with a more flexible, curious calibration. Okay, this is how I see it. How might they see it differently? And a willingness to adjust.
So, practically speaking, how do we apply this? The sources seem to give us a kind of framework for navigating this messy world of assumptions and using common sense a bit more wisely.
Yeah, they offer some concrete steps. First step, pause before you assume. That moment your brain supplies an answer and says, well, that's obvious. Try to mentally flag it.
Like putting up a little yellow caution sign?
Kind of. Ask yourself, okay, wait, am I filling in this gap with my own projection, my own experience, or is there actual evidence of shared understanding here? Treat your assumption like a hypothesis you need to test, not a proven fact.
Okay, second step.
Ask before you explain. We talked about this regarding condescension. Instead of just launching into giving context or clarification, use those opt-in phrases. Would it help if I shared some background? Or are you already familiar with this part? It builds that consensual communication.
Right.
Focus on intent and impact. Your intention might have been perfectly good. Maybe you were genuinely trying to be helpful or clear. But if the impact on the other person was negative, maybe they felt misunderstood or patronized or dismissed so overall, you need to own that gap.
No.
By acknowledging it and inviting dialogue, maybe saying something like, I realize now that might have come across differently than I meant it. Can you tell me how that landed for you?
Focus on understanding their experience of your words.
That takes vulnerability. Okay, fourth step.
Own your lenses. Be transparent about where your perspective is coming from. Instead of saying, well, everyone knows this, try phrasing it like, this seems like common sense to me, maybe because of my background in X or from my experience. Acknowledge your own situated knowledge and the potential biases that come with it.
That feels much more humble and open. Fifth, create space for repair, not perfection. Normalize the fact that communication is often messy and imperfect. Show through your actions that you value responsiveness and the willingness to fix missteps more than you value someone being flawlessly clear right out of the gate. Make it safe to fumble.
Okay. And sixth.
Replace certainty with curiosity. This might be the biggest shift. When someone does or says something that bumps up against your common sense, try to consciously shift gears. Move away from, they should know better, or that's so weird,
And
towards something like, that's interesting. I wonder what experience or perspective led them to see it that way. Let me try to understand where they're coming from. Curiosity over judgment.
It really sounds like it's about recognizing that assumptions are just part of being human. They're unavoidable shortcuts. But we can soften their edges, make them less harmful.
Exactly. Common sense is a useful tool sometimes, maybe even essential for navigating daily life efficiently. But it has to be wielded with humility, with an awareness of its very real limitations, and with a willingness to question it.
Which brings us right back to where we started, doesn't it? And that classic quote about assuming making an S. Well,
It does. And what these sources ultimately show, I think, is that good communication isn't really about being perfectly clear right from the start or possessing all the common sense the world supposedly demands.
it's more about the willingness to repair things when they go wrong, to revise your understanding when you get new information, to patiently try and reconnect with someone even after a misunderstanding.
That seems to be the core message. And the final thought the sources leave us with really captures this more humane, more realistic perspective. It's the idea that if we aim for repair and for grace and for just consistent effort in how we talk to each other,
You're doing what?
we're embracing our fundamental humanity.
The humanity to stumble, to not always get it right, but to learn, and to try speaking again, maybe a little differently, a little more carefully this time.
Precisely. And maybe, just maybe, in that messy, imperfect process of fumbling and repairing, finding genuine connection and understanding anyway, maybe that is the most uncommon and most valuable sense of all.